Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Pink and HQ for what is today's preview show. I'm Connor Saville. Hopefully going to be joined by Samuel Seaman very shortly to look ahead to tomorrow's game against Sheffield United. Very exciting game in store against obviously the team who are second in the Championship. And it starts what is an absolutely massive 8 games for Norwich City and obviously their top 6 prospects. And I should say, hopefully, joining me very, very shortly is Samuel Seaman to discuss all the key issues. I was at the press conference this morning with David Wagner, which was interesting, insightful as ever. He was, I think it's very obvious to see he's a man who is bubbling with excitement at the prospect of the next 8 games, which lends me really to lean into a question I wanted to put to you guys watching today. 8 games left. I want to hear from you guys how many points Norwich City are going to accrue in that time and also which league position they are going to finish in. And I'm delighted my colleague, Mr. Samuel Seaman, joins me now. Hello, Sam. Thanks for joining. You hopefully heard my question there. So I'm going to start with that one with you. Well, maybe I'll start with a different question. We'll come back to that one. Let's start with these 8 games and look at them as a package. I mean, absolutely crucial. I think you could probably distill it even further to the next 4 games where Norwich play Sheffield United, obviously Blackburn next week, Rotherham on Easter Monday before a trip to Middlesbrough. Feels like a decisive kind of 4 games. So with that in mind, looking ahead to tomorrow, how important is it that Norwich City, I guess, give us some positivity and try and change the narrative that was kind of set before the international break with what was a disappointing week?
Well, I think the positivity is almost there naturally because of the lack of games for a couple of weeks. I think it's natural for football fans during these international breaks to probably regenerate the amount of enthusiasm they had before, because as much as things were disappointing and it wasn't exactly the most exciting performance or result when they went to Stoke, I think that separation probably means Norwich fans will be absolutely buzzing to be back at Carrow Road on Saturday, as much as the performances haven't perhaps been as entertaining or as ideal as they'd like over the last couple of weeks. Hopefully this offers the opportunity at a sort of reset. And I think when you spoke to Max Aarons before the international break, he actually said that he thought that reset would do Norwich some good. And I think anybody who's of a yellow and green persuasion or has been keeping up with their results over the last few weeks will agree with that. So I actually think it's a positive in itself, just the scheduling. But as you say, there's a lot of onus on Norwich now to show their fans that for this one last push towards Championship promotion and hopefully the playoffs, they are going to give them something and at least a fight over the next 8 games. Because I was thinking, as you read those fixtures out, if they don't perform, if they don't get out of the blocks quickly after this break, it could all be over in the next 4 or 5 games, really. And that would be a really sorry thing if Norwich aren't even fighting come the end of the season. So, a lot of pressure on them right now, but hopefully an exciting time. And I think the sort of times that we're all football fans for, right? Because, this is what we want, as opposed to sterile behind closed doors seasons where perhaps it's a little bit easy and that was entertaining to watch at times. But I think this is what fans are excited for and what football fans live for. And I think David Wagner is hoping to channel a bit of that with the Carrow Road atmosphere tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously we're coming off the back of an international break. So like you say, some of that exists already just through virtue of having no football to get your teeth stuck into for a couple of weeks. But it was interesting to listen to David Wagner this morning and get your opinion as well. I mean, how would you approach it for him? Do you almost lean into that kind of optimism that, say, the Scottish lads have at the moment? I guess Angus Gunn in particular, but Grant Hanley and Kenny McLean, all of whom were involved in a pretty successful break by all accounts, obviously capped off by that famous victory against Spain, which was incredible, even as someone who doesn't really like international football in kind of that setting. But also you've got obviously the narratives from Ireland, Adam Ida's injury not being as bad as he or as Norwich first feared. Andrew Omobamidele obviously being in the national squad for the first time in, what was it, a year and a half or so since 2021. Lots of narratives there that he can maybe lean into for some positivity, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wrote earlier about Angus Gunn and how that might actually benefit the morale of the team and his form personally. And I think the number of players that were involved in those sorts of fixtures and that will have a bit of momentum behind them after that, I think will really benefit Norwich, because we've spoken a few times this season about how important momentum is at the top end of the Championship. And now you've got a goalkeeper who's kept 2 clean sheets, again, including one against Spain. The same of Grant Hanley at the centre of defence. You got Kenny McLean, who's involved in that very successful period as well. And just everything that you spoke about, really, I'd reiterate in terms of how that's going to improve morale. And the way that we've spoken about that element of things this season probably tells you that should actually provide Norwich with quite a large advantage. If the dressing room suffering has meant poor results at times this season, and the damp atmosphere at Carrow Road has meant the same, then we probably have to flip it and look at things the same way this way and say that actually it could be quite a big thing. And as much as I'm sure all football fans, or the large majority of football fans, would like to ignore these sorts of international breaks when you're searching for some positives, I think it can certainly provide them. And perhaps in the same way that the FA Cup run provided some relief and some belief, actually, in that 2019-20 season, perhaps the international break can do the same for Norwich and their players over the next few weeks. And I think that could be another factor. But there's so many things going into it, and I think Norwich fans will be looking for any possible factor, because if they are involved come the end of the season, then it's going to be so tight. And I think, you're looking at the small margins for how they could benefit Norwich.
How many wins do you think it's going to take? I guess that's kind of the obvious question, isn't it? I think 5 would put them. I'm testing my maths. I promised myself I'd memorise these after the podcast every week. I think 5 would take them to 73, which 72, 73 maybe. I'll talk myself out of that. And I think an extra 6 would take them over 75, which is a general rule of thumb. I don't think a team that's got 75 points has ever finished outside the top 6. Probably in reality won't need as much of that, because you've got a runaway leader at the top, right? So everyone's points are a bit more compressed. So 8 games left. What are you looking at in terms of a points target? David Wagner obviously refused to put one on this morning, which I think was wise. What do you feel it will take for Norwich City in terms of pure mathematics?
It's quite tough. I was thinking 4 wins. I think if you can get 4 wins, especially given the quality of the Championship this year and the sort of condensed points as you spoke about, then they probably leave themselves some room for manoeuvre. You don't want to lose all the other 4 games, but with the fixtures they've got, I think it's quite unrealistic for us to come out and say they need to win 6 games or whatever, or maybe even 5 games is slightly unrealistic given the inconsistency of their performance this season. So I think if I was them, I'd be looking at 4 as a minimum, and then hopefully building it with some good performances and some good points in the others, because they have got a really quite difficult fixture running. But I think if they can get the momentum over the next few games, maybe if they can just get a couple of wins against the likes of Sheffield United and Blackburn, I know it won't necessarily come against those two, but in the tough 4 games, then they give themselves probably confidence and some momentum against some of the Championship's weaker sides, and in some games that you'd say should be routine victories for Norwich. So I wouldn't want to put a number on it either. I remember after lockdown and there was Project Restart, I remember Daniel Farker saying, was it 5 wins that he started with, and then once you've got 4 games left, it was quite an interesting thing that he was saying, and you can't really, the only thing you can say at that point is, oh well, we've got to keep fighting. It's the same with if David Wagner says we need to get 5 wins and they lose the first 4 games, then it's all out of the window. So I think that was probably the smart move from him in the press conference this morning. But for me personally, I don't think you're getting away with less than 4 wins, really. But asking for more than 4 might be slightly unrealistic, to be honest.
Yeah, interesting comment we've had from Lee on Facebook, who said, I said all season we would finish top 6 and I haven't wavered. Having said that, the idea of getting relegated up to the Premier League is utterly terrifying. I think that's a nice insight into maybe how some Norwich City fans feel. Again, we've had another comment here from Stephen. Gents, we talk about an overhaul of the team for next year in the Championship. What on earth would they do for a Premier League season? I personally think Norwich does not have funds to do a Nottingham Forest overhaul, which no, they definitely don't. So all of this is really interesting in that sense of change and stuff that's on the horizon. I think we'll probably park for a different conversation at a different point. In terms of the injury news today, Sam, obviously Adam Eder, as I said, right at the top, I think is a little bit better than they thought. So he comes into contention again this weekend. All the internationals have returned. Sam Byram's back in training, but I think David Wagner is still plotting a few weeks before we could see him back involved in the team. Onel Hernandez and John Rowe will both miss tomorrow, but also doubtful for the Easter games as well. So in terms of squad, he's probably not looking at a different squad or too much of a different squad compared to the one that finished the break. So this idea of kind of changing narrative and optics, and what we said there about kind of navigating route to the playoffs. They've got 4 home games left. It probably does feel like it's the type of game that people will be looking at and fans will be looking at and saying, go on then, if you're going to get in the top 6, show us what you can do on this occasion. So even though that there's maybe not a natural expectation given where Sheffield United are in the league, it still feels like there's maybe a little bit of an onus on them to produce something. And that's going to be a really interesting dynamic, and to see how they kind of respond to that with a group of players who, of course, before the break produced 3 pretty flat performances.
Yeah, absolutely. And the quality of the opposition probably goes against them in a big way this week, actually, because as you said, there's a lot on them to now go and show that they're capable of producing the results to get into the playoffs. And with the number of injuries they've got and the side facing them, you do wonder if it's the odds are stacked against them a little bit. And I don't want to give them an excuse. I think in the Championship, in any game, and I've said this all season, as much as we've got to readjust expectations, and Wagner was right to say that a couple of weeks ago, Norwich should be able to compete with any team in the Championship, really, and they should probably go into any game in the Championship thinking they can win. So I don't want to give them too many excuses, but it's not a perfect game for building momentum and showing people that you're there. But then you look at things the opposite way, and perhaps we're being negative, and you can say that if they do win this game, they really send out a big statement, and that probably gets fans right up for a huge 7 games. So it feels like a bigger game because of that. I think if this had come in the middle of a run of, I don't know if there's ever this actual number of consecutive games, but sometimes it feels like we've got 15 games in a row in about a month from sort of the schedule and the way that things play out. I think if it had come in the middle of them, it wouldn't have felt like such a big game. But the fact that it's so isolated and so important for games coming up, I think does make it feel like a bigger game. But when I was doing tactics board and I was trying to predict the Norwich team, I did consider the fact that Wagner really doesn't have a lot of options. You look at that Stoke team, and that was set up to basically go away to Stoke and get a point. And you'd like to see something different, and you'd like to see Norwich come out and play with a more attacking style. But barring them rearranging the players that they had and putting them in different positions, you wonder how they could adjust that with some of the players that they've got out, how they could adjust that to go and attack a team at Carrow Road. So it's going to be a difficult task for Wagner. Perhaps he's going to have to compromise the quality of some of the players in his team. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he addresses that. But yeah, as you said, huge game because of that expectation on them to go and produce and go and prove that they can compete in these final 8 games.
Yeah, there was obviously a lot of debate after that Stoke draw. And, I think we said throughout, probably actually if they'd have won at Huddersfield, I think the Stoke point gets reflected on in maybe a different way. I think it was almost the disappointment of that as a 2-game period rather than that in isolation. But it provoked lots of debate about the way Norwich City set up, and obviously that more pragmatic approach and more conservative approach that he adopted. They essentially played 2 fullbacks, didn't they? One that was quite narrow and one that was a little bit wider in an attempt to basically try and halt what Stoke have done very well in recent weeks, which is these kind of long diagonal balls into each flank, which probably did work on the balance of it, particularly in the second half where they were able to nullify, although they did have a period in the first half where it did feel like Angus Gunn was playing against 10 outfield Stoke players. So lots and lots of debate, but I guess to kind of move it on, how does David Wagner go about approaching this weekend? Because as we said, the squad is largely the same. It's a test against a side who are obviously chasing automatic promotion, also in an FA Cup semi-final, which we'll come back to. Does he go back to kind of his belief and what we'd seen from him pre-Stoke, and that game almost gets lost in isolation? Or are we looking at it again with a similar squad, like you say, very few options in wide areas in particular? And are we looking at Norwich City deploying a similar approach and almost trying to get through the game? What's kind of your take on it?
I hope it's a balance of both, because I think Norwich need points at this stage, and setting up to get a point maybe isn't going to do it. I'm not saying maybe you wouldn't take a point from this game, but the fact is, even in the games where Norwich would take a point between now and the end of the season, the situation is such that even in those games, I think they still have to give themselves a chance of getting 3 points. So even if they go and set up and say, yes, we'll be slightly more physical and we might not have as much of the possession. I hope they also are aware that wins will be huge between now and the end of the season, and they leave the door open a little bit more than they did against Stoke, actually, to perhaps going and getting that result. I think the fact that they're at home puts more pressure on them to play an attacking style as well, and also the fact that their players are probably more geared to that. You have to remember they actually don't have a player that's nailed down the defensive midfield spot in the squad. They don't have anybody who's impressed the manager enough to start every game in defensive midfield, and basing a side on defensive principles and getting a clean sheet in every game is quite tough when you have that, and when you have defenders who have made mistakes in recent games. You have fullbacks who maybe are struggling for confidence at times and who have been criticised for their defensive ability. I'm not sure that's the right time to be saying now that they'll set up defensively for the rest of the season. But you look at the opposition, and for me, there's no doubt you have to do something to address it. You can't be going out with the sort of early Wagner setup of Sargent and Pukki up front and Gabriel Sara and Kenny McLean in midfield, because the way that Sheffield United set up and the physicality and the quality that they have, I think Norwich would just get picked off. So those two elements mean you can't go extreme either way for me, and I think David Wagner will, and I hope he will, go with something slightly more balanced, hopefully something slightly more entertaining than it was against Stoke. And I think the fans will probably demand that. But I'm interested to see how he does that, because as you said, and as I said before, he doesn't really have the players to play around with to try and achieve that balance. So it will be a difficult one. But yeah, I think you have to probably err on the side of caution while leaving the door slightly open, because they do need points, and they are right now in a chasing position. If they were in a position where they're in the playoffs, perhaps they can afford to say, okay, we'll take a draw against one of the Championship's top teams, go on their Millwall, go and get a result. But they're not in that position, and they need to get points. So yeah, it's a difficult balance to strike, but probably possible for me.
Yes, and I know you did your tactics board video where you did your predicted 11, didn't you? I'm going to ask you for what maybe you think David Wagner will do tomorrow, because I think there's a lot of interesting calls to be made, obviously, and you kind of touched upon some of them there. Does he go with that Pukki Sargent axis up top again? Do we see them pull an extra man into midfield? I don't think we're going to see Max Aarons as a right winger again. I think we'll probably see him revert to where he was. So probably from midfield forwards, how do you see Norwich City lining up? Do you see it in that kind of 4-2-3-1 shape, more of the 4-4-2 that we saw? What's kind of your feeling heading into tomorrow?
It's a really difficult one, because I probably don't think there's room for Josh Sargent there. I think if you're not going with Max Aarons as a right winger, and Wagner doesn't really tend to like Sargent at all as a right winger. I'm not sure if he's even played him there yet. I think that's probably an element to look at. But I think managers love Josh Sargent. As much as he maybe winds up fans sometimes and his touch isn't brilliant, he's the sort of player who, because of his work rate and his attitude and probably the physicality that gives Norwich a different option, both Dean Smith and David Wagner seem to really love having him in the team. So I'm not sure if I see Wagner dropping him, but it's just where you go from there to bolster the midfield. Do you have Jakob Sorensen and Kenny McLean as an axis, and then Gabriel Sara maybe off one of the wings? They are short in the wing areas because of those injuries. So I think that's a balance maybe to strike. And I think Sara played on the right wing briefly as a substitute earlier this season. So it's probably possible, but it's about whether you want to compromise the effectiveness of one of your best players. And I'd say certainly Norwich's most creative attacking player over the last few weeks. So if I had to guess what Wagner does, it is really difficult because of that winger situation. But the only thing that I can really think of would be Sara out wide, because it's either for me Sara out wide, or you drop Sargent and you have Marquinhos and you go with Sara, McLean and Sorensen as a 3. What he does there is really difficult for me to predict, because I think he loves Josh Sargent and he loves what he brings to the game. But if you're having Marquinhos on the right and Sara in midfield, then you have to choose between Tamer Pukki and Josh Sargent. And for me, there's only one man you're picking there.
Could you not see Josh Sargent off one of the sides? And obviously, I guess Adam Ida comes into it as well as someone who, although I would be absolutely shocked, given I think he only played 20 minutes for Ireland, didn't he, against France, if he was an option from the start. But Could you see Josh Sargent move into one of those wider roles, as has been the case for certainly a bulk of the first half of the season, at least?
I really, really hope not. I think it's possible, but I really don't like him in that role at all. And Wagner, when he came in, said that he didn't see Sargent as a winger. And to be fair to him, he's delivered on that. We haven't seen him on the wing under Wagner. Not a lot, if at all. So that's giving me faith that we're not going to see Josh Sargent as a winger. I'm not sure that's his best position at all. But because of the reasons I spoke about, it seems possible. It seems like when you don't have another option and he's a player you want to keep in the team, is it possible? And I'd say yes. I say yes, it is. It is certainly something that might happen, but I'm sure I'm in the large majority when I say I hope we don't see him as a right winger tomorrow.
Yes, and I would concur. And certainly on form, at least, missed a wonderful opportunity at Stoke, which completely changes the dynamic of that. Be curious to see whether he does make the starting 11 at all, because I can see I need to call him Daniel Farke there. There we go. You got to get one in per record that you do. Whether I think David Wagner will go back to that kind of 3-man midfield that we saw him use against Millwall. That probably then does open up a wide slot maybe. And I think you're right. If you play Jolis on one side, do you then have a Sargent or an Eder on the other? I don't know. I think all of these are really interesting debates. Obviously, someone like Liam Gibbs, Nunez could come into the equation, as well then. So all of that is very interesting. Nicky knows the drill. They've been here long enough. Score predictions, get them in, people. Let's hear them. How do you see tomorrow's game going? I did want to chat a little bit about Sheffield United before we head off into our afternoons, Sam. I mean, they're in a really interesting place because I've spoken to a couple of Sheffield United fans over the international break who really aren't feeling confident about this game. And I think the reality of Middlesbrough's surge has caught up on them. They've got a 3-point cushion at the moment, plus a game in hand on Borough. They've failed to win consecutive games in just about a month. I think the last time they did it was the back end of February, early March. Suggestion that perhaps the performances haven't necessarily been that great. Obviously, the distraction, which is how it's been framed, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but that's how it's been framed by some, of reaching an FA Cup semi-final. All of this probably adds to the trepidation, I suppose, that those Sheffield United fans are feeling at the moment. How do you assess where they are and where they are coming into this game as well? Because again, they haven't really got that much margin for error now in terms of Middlesbrough and the form that they're in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting position that Sheffield United find themselves in, because I think in fact, nearly every good Championship team has this moment. I remember when Norwich last won the league, they finished with, I think it was 97 points. Yeah, 97 points. And there was still a couple of games, a week or so, where I think they drew with Millwall and lost to Swansea, and Norwich fans were absolutely panicking, and myself included at the time, and there was a real worry about whether Norwich were going to bottle it and lose the lead that they built up. So I think Sheffield United find themselves in a natural position for a side that's chasing promotion, especially in the Championship, given how sort of topsy-turvy it can be and how inconsistent it's been, and never has that been truer than this season. So it makes sense to me that they've had a wobble. I think Middlesbrough are a good side who are really putting them under a lot of pressure. But it's one of those, without wanting to patronise, because now I'm quite wary of, after the sort of a lot of the national reaction to Dean Smith's sacking, I'm now wary of judging opposition clubs maybe and where they are, and saying, "Oh, you'll be fine," because I think when it's your club, it doesn't ever feel like that. So Sheffield United fans at the moment are probably looking at all the mitigation, all the reasons why it might fall apart. But just from experience, and there's no greater experience of Championship promotion than being first a Norwich City fan and then somebody who covers them. I'd say it's something that every good Championship team goes through, and they are a good Championship team. They will provide Norwich with a real test, and they look like a team that's quite well coached and can reproduce. They're not solely based on momentum like a lot of the teams in this league are. So it's not like they'll come to Carrow Road without feeling good about themselves and that will decide the result. I think they've probably got consistent principles and consistent players who will produce performances and make it difficult for Norwich no matter what happens. So I'm probably somewhere between the two extremes on Sheffield United. It is certainly a worry, and Middlesbrough are a good team chasing them down. But they wouldn't be in this position had they not shown that they've got quality players and that they've got quality at this level and a manager who can set them up to win games. So for me, it's going to be an absolutely massive test for Norwich, probably even more of a test than it was at Bramall Lane, which was a game I felt they should have won. I think personally that Sheffield United will be promoted, and that shows the calibre of team that are coming to Carrow Road on Saturday. So it will be really, really tough. But hopefully Norwich can stand up to the test, and if they can produce to the levels that we know they're capable of, then they could very, very well still come away with 3 points.
Yes, quite. They're a really interesting example, actually, because they maybe to an extent counter a little bit of the narrative that's building about Norwich City, where a lot of people are talking about rebuilds and end of cycles. And I think, we've certainly had those discussions extensively on podcasts and on these before. And you look at the names in their squad: John Egan, John Fleck, Chris Basham, Billy Sharp, Ollie Norwood. I mean, players who are recognisable from that achievement and that group, a core of player who played under Chris Wilder a few years ago and got themselves into the Premier League, finished 7th, obviously, and went down the subsequent season. Last year, I'm sure, I must admit, I wasn't fully tuned into the Sheffield United fan debate, but I'm sure there were some calls about end of era and whatnot. And they obviously failed to get promotion, and yet they've retained that core and they've been able to kind of push this year. So maybe they offer a little bit. I'm not necessarily saying I agree. I'm just playing devil's advocate. But there is maybe an argument that they do counter a little bit of the narrative that surrounds Norwich City at this moment in time. Maybe the point you would make is all of those names I reeled off: Fleck, Basham, Sharp, Norwood. They were all on the bench for their 2-1 victory over Sunderland for their last championship game. And also you could argue that they have a better quality of player, someone like Sander Berg in midfield, who is excellent, Iliman and Dye, who's had a breakout season, Max Lowe, Jason McAtee, Tommy Doyle, all of these players who have performed really, really well this season. But there we go. I'm just leaving that one out there to float. Maybe we'll come back to it and discuss it at some point in a bit more depth. How do you see this going then, Sam? I mean, as we said, a really, really difficult test, however you try and preview it, and we've tried to do that for the last 28 minutes or so. How do you see it transpiring? How do you see Norwich City adapting to it? They haven't got a great record against the teams in the top 6 this season, although Sheffield United, I think it's only Millwall and Sheffield United who obviously Millwall didn't beat Norwich City. This is the last chance for Sheffield United to beat Norwich City. All of the other teams have. Some of them, most of them, all of them? Possibly, no, not Middlesbrough. Most of them have done doubles. How do you see this transpiring for a group who David Wagner has said isn't the best at dealing with adversity? It feels like they're going to have to come through quite a bit tomorrow, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like the sort of game that they really need a positive start, because to me, if they go down 1-0 to Sheffield United, they're well drilled enough and defensive. They have enough defensive quality that Norwich, with some of the mentality issues they struggle with, especially having gone a goal down, I'm really struggling to see them coming back into the game after that. So if it plays out like that, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see it play out similarly to that Sunderland defeat. I think that was the last game at Carrow Road. And yeah, I'm not sure I feel totally positive about that. But if Norwich come out and start well and have the energy and the quality that we've seen before, I think perhaps Sheffield United start to worry, because as we just spoke about, they are probably worrying, and they probably have got that question in the back of their minds as to whether they're going to bottle this and whether they're going to see the season through, and whether they're going to fulfill the promise that they had earlier this season. So if they come to Carrow Road, Norwich start really positively and they're overwhelmed, that could go really, really well. So I think it's about a good start in a big way, but as we've said over and over again, it'll be a really, really huge test, and one that probably Norwich need a little bit of luck to go in their favour. They need a really good performance, and it'll be interesting to see whether they can do it. But yeah, personally, I think with the momentum going the way it is, Norwich probably can get a draw and probably would take a draw.
Yeah, I'm struggling to forecast a positive result for Norwich, if I'm honest. I've got not a great feeling about this weekend's game, just in terms of opponents that I think they're going to come and be utterly ferocious in kind of their efforts to press the ball. We've obviously seen Norwich City struggles in that area. don't get particularly good feeling, but that I'm usually pretty wrong, so we'll see. We will of course be at Carrow Road tomorrow for what is a massive game. We'll have team news live at 2:00, all of our usual coverage across our channels throughout the afternoon, before obviously we then sit down and record a podcast and do all the various bits of analysis and reaction leading on to the Easter games, which obviously kick off away at Blackburn on Good Friday. Sorry, they called it Easter Friday then. That's not good. There we go. Thank you very much for watching. Plenty more at pinkin.com, of course, from David Wagner's press conference. I'm sure the full video and whatnot will appear on YouTube very shortly as well. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.